All right, so pleasant good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. Looking at, can everybody see my screen? Are you seeing the presentation? Just want to make sure everybody's seeing the presentation. Give me a thumbs up, please. Good, thank you, Abby. Wonderful. So we're getting into this discussion this evening, talking about first in our equity series, as we're looking at how do we disrupt and dismantle deficit thinking in our schools. And I want you to understand that deficit thinking is one of those major issues we have in our school system, where our educators do not see, all our educators do not see our students as the possibility and potential that they have. And out of this, you'll see when I show you later on, the many different issues that arrive out of, because we have deficit thinking. You know, institutions are seen as, many of these institutions are oppressive spaces, and school is seen as one of those oppressive space because of the very nature of what schooling is and how we envision school supposed to be. You know, if you ask many Black students, right? If you ask many Black students, if you ask many students of color, Muslim students, LGBTQ students, and many others who are othered, many of our students who are othered within our schools and greater spaces, they will tell you that they do not feel a sense of belonging. Many of our students will tell you that they do not feel a sense of belonging. They do not sense a sense of value, care. They feel oppressed, excluded, judged. They simply do not feel seen, which is a major argument for this as a prevailing ideas of deficit thinking is found in our schools and in our classrooms. So when I shared with you the overview for the presentation, you saw I included a narrative. But out of that narrative, I want to just select a few points that were made from the narrative. And the idea about deficit thinking is that, you know, it's a persistence of low expectation and deficit mentality that is evidenced in many classrooms. So I want you to think about it that way. When we say deficit thinking, this is the persistence of low expectation for many of our students in our classrooms. I want you to just to capture that very, very idea of the persistence of low expectations. And think about that. If there's a persistence of low expectations, how is that evidence in your teaching as an educator? How do you think that is evidence in what we celebrate or do not celebrate in our schools? How do you think that is evidence in the curriculum? In who is selected for programs, gifted programs, who is placed in certain programs, accommodations, modifications. So I really want you to think wide when you think of deficit thinking and how it impacts the classroom, how it impacts our students, how it impacts our families, our parents. I want you to really think. These deficit ideologies impact student identity and sense of belonging. Just think about yourself going to school. If there was ever a time when you felt like you didn't belong to school, how that impacted how you saw school, or how that impacted how you believe you were able to engage in school. You know, it affects how they are offered. It affects what they are offered, and the opportunities that they are afforded in our schools. We can see that. Many students are sitting in our classroom affected by deficit thinking. You may think about anti-Black racism and racism, think about homophobia, think about Islamophobia, think about all those kind of issues. They are found in school. And that is why in your particular courses, if you're dealing with issues in education, some of you, your module is focused on diversity and inclusion. Some of you are being exposed to concepts of equity that you have never been exposed to before, because we do not unpack them and we do not have these real courageous conversations about what happens in school. And then my fourth point is that many of our educators and our principals, some of you are in educational leadership yourself, you will lament that you do not have the tools And what that happens is that we do not go from a strength base, but we go from the deficit. And I want you to understand, this is something I want us to bring in at this time, the idea of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. I really want you to bring that in at this point, because if you know anything about culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, you will know that there are three tenets. There are three tenets. And the number one tenet, or the number one thing that makes a school, a classroom, a space really culturally relevant and responsive to our students, the number one thing, I'm sure you know it, and that is holding high expectations of our learners. And that is why when I wrote the article, the chapter which is going to come out soon, and I share it with all of you when it comes out, is using culturally relevant responsive pedagogy as a means to disrupt and dismantle deficit thinking in our schools. Because remember, as I said to you before, the number one tenet, the first of three tenets of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy is holding high expectations of our students. And that is what we want. The opposite, if you're, we want you to move from deficit thinking to holding high expectations of our students. That's why we have so many issues with how we discipline Black boys in school. There is a lot of discussion about how we discipline Black boys in school. Because if you think about it, historically, the issues we see stems from the deficit, the laundry list. We see the students only as a laundry list of problems. And these educators are unable to look past students' more challenging behavior, making meaningful and reciprocal relationship possible. That's what we're talking about. So that's why we really want us to look at how deficit mentality blocks your view of seeing the possibility. If you walk into a classroom and you see you have a number of students who are immigrants or they are refugees, immediately you go to deficit. Oh, they are refugees. And what you do, you layer on the deficit ideas. So when you think of refugee, you think of, well, this child maybe doesn't have the finances. Maybe this child doesn't have the support. This child maybe doesn't have family. This child coming from a place where they have nothing to eat. Well, the truth is, if you really understand the reasons why many persons become refugees, you'll realize that there are refugees even in Canada that have come from amazing homes. And before the war or before whatever happened that turned them into a refugee, they lived an amazing life. But deficit thinking doesn't allow us to see that. When we see a term refugee, we see negative. It's just like, for instance, how many of our students you think are challenged in our school because they come off the plane and they are placed in ESL and ELL, and they are placed in these programs because they don't have the Canadian English. What many teachers and leaders don't understand is that some of these students are the very students who speak 4 and 5 other languages. I want you to think about that. The same students who we have placed in certain programs, and we look at them as if they have nothing to offer. They bring nothing. They bring no cultural competence with them. They bring no cultural assets. They bring nothing with them. Are the same students who, if you get to know them, you realize their gifts, their talents. So it's important that we understand how deficit thinking can disrupt quality education. And because of that, we have our negative stereotype. So I have given that activity more than once. And I think if you're in my class, you'll see me do this activity. And I would say to our students, what are some of the things you think? These are students' knapsack. What are the things you see that they bring to school? What are those things that they bring to school with them? And you get a good list. You get a good list, and an honest list. I must say, a very honest list. And you'll see the divorce, the racism, the abuse, the molestation, lack of breakfast. You see broken homes. There's just a laundry list. And if I ask you to do that as an activity, you could do that. What sometimes we don't do is we don't see what else is in their bag. So I want you to really take a minute to get this context. If you see all the negatives, ask yourself, do I see the positives? Do I see other things, the possibilities within that knapsack? the many languages, the culture, the gifts, the talents, their lived experiences, their stories. We have to think about that when we think about what's going on with our students. You know, this deficit thinking can be seen in many aspects of our schools: curriculum, teacher hiring, support program, ESL, the ways in which we provide accommodations and modifications, the way we stream, who gets in a gifted program, or who is channeled always to those other programs. We see deficit thinking in how we talk to certain parents. There are parents who will tell you, especially in urban spaces, will tell you that they are spoken to by teachers and administrators in ways that says to them, you don't belong here. We see deficit thinking in how we think about certain students who are good at and what we give them access to. You know, the Black student, you could run. So yes, we want you to go run. But what opportunities are created for that student? Because what we do, the deficit thinking, is mixed with our stereotypes and our assumptions. And we use those stereotypes, we use those assumptions, and they impact our teaching. They impact our pedagogy. They impact our educational leadership skills. We make decisions. I want you to hear me when I say this. We make the many decisions in our schools are made based on stereotypes and assumptions. I want to repeat that. Many educational decisions we have in schools, they are based on our stereotypes and our assumptions. So I want you to understand that deficit thinking does impact, absolutely impact how we see and how we do school. It impacts. So what is deficit thinking? This quote from Sharma 2018 I really like. Deficit thinking is a very common way of thinking which affects our general way of being in and constructing the world. Differences from the norm are immediately seen as being depraved, negative, and disadvantaged. So if it's not the norm, if it's not what we call the dominant pedagogy, the dominant thinking, the dominant ideas, and anything less than that, deficit. That is why we have so much, Islamophobia and homophobia and Black racism and anti-Black racism, because they are from what we consider to be the norm. And we, the society, have established what is normal. And when you establish what is norm, then you establish what is against the norm. It never questions legitimacy of what is deemed to be normal, nor does it consider that differences may actually go beyond expected norms. Let me give you a personal example. I remember the first time I started teaching at OISE. And now you have to remember, I walk into a classroom of 30 students. You have to remember that in our MT program, most of our classes are 30 students, and 27 of those, or 26, will be white students. And I'm going to tell you, white students who have never had a Black professor. I want you to understand. So immediately what happened is that immediately my position comes into play. My Blackness, my Jamaicanness, my accent, my dialect, all of that comes into play. And because it is different from the norm, because in your undergrad year, you have had 25, 30 courses and you have a 25, 30 white professor, all of a sudden you see someone in front of you. And immediately that difference as being a Black professor is equate to negative, disadvantage, less than. And what happens is that many Black professors have to overteach and do so much to kind of earn their keep or to be given the same value. Why? Because we are wired like that. So as an educator, as a person who is a leader in education, I want you to understand how your assumptions, your wired, your unconscious bias, all of that impacts teaching. And we want you to understand that. We want you to really understand that. 2 more quick quotes before we move on. Deficit thinking leads to stereotyping and prejudging. It marginalizes certain people on the basis of misinformation and misconstructions. And that is why we have certain streaming in our schools. We have seen it. We have seen it in the news. The school boards are being challenged about why certain students, especially Black students or students of color, racialized students, are not given certain opportunities. We see the disproportionate number in suspension of Black and brown students. We see the disproportionate number of students, or Black students, who get into gifted programs. We see that. We see it in our schools because a lot of the decisions are made on misinformation and misconstruction. So I think it's a question I would love to ask all of us in the room today, as we have this engagement, is think about some of the unconscious bias you hold. I want you to think about some of the unconscious biases that you hold, some of the misconceptions, the assumptions, the stereotypes that you hold. I want you to think about that and think how they find root in the education system. Another quote here says, sadly, many educators and administrators aren't even aware of the deficit model of education prevalent in many school systems. You know, I know after this, many of you are going to do a reflection, you're going to do a discussion, you're going to engage in writing. This is something that I would love for some of you to take on personally. Think about it. Is that, are you aware of the deficit model in your school? Because the truth is, when you ask some of these questions, people tell you, you know, it's just like when you talk about unconscious bias. There are many people who will immediately say to you, well, I don't think I have any unconscious bias. And then as you unpack what is an unconscious bias and how unconscious biases operate, immediately will tell you, I do have unconscious bias, because we all do. And the reason why some of us have less than some is because we are active. We are active in unpacking and discovering them so we can eliminate them. Listen what I just said. You are active in unpacking and discovering your unconscious bias. You're bringing them to the forefront so you can eliminate them. In my work as a classroom teacher, workshop presenter, college and university professor, I have seen a lack of awareness in many spaces. Apathy, passivity, indifference on the part of many educators. And in those spaces, there is a disconnect between educators and the students they teach. So that may be the next thing for you to unpack. Think about the disconnect between educators and the students they teach. You know, there are so many privileged educators that are in charge of schools where students struggle. And I always wonder and ask myself, do educators really engage in the time it requires for them to really get to understand their students, understand who they have in front of them, so they can understand how to teach? And then another big one we have is a lack of representation in our schools. I'm sure some of you have seen this slide before. If not, you have seen it. The changing face of Ontario. This came from the 2009 Ontario Equity Inclusive Education Strategy. So you can look this up. It's Ontario's Equity and Inclusive Education Strategy, 2009, 11 years ago. The changing face. How are we dealing with the changing face in our schools? The other day, I had the pleasure of speaking to a school from the upper, it's way out of Toronto, in Ontario, but way out of Toronto. And I am doing a workshop with the school. And they said to me, Dr. Campbell, we have never had so many racialized students, never had so many brown students, never had so many Black students in our school. Years we have never had that. They said this year our numbers are way significant. And the first question I asked was, what have we done differently since now we have so many Black students in our school, racialized students in our school? What are you doing differently? And of course, I'm sure you understand, there are many things that are not being done differently. So we go back again to the idea of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. And we are going to dig into that some more. I think we're going to have an opportunity to dig into that. Yes, we're going to have an opportunity on March the 8th. On March the 8th to dig into that a little bit more. But I want you to understand that culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy is not a sprinkle on. It's not, oh, it's First Nations Month. Let me go read an book written by an Indigenous author. Or it's, oh, it's Orange T-shirt Day. Let me go read a story. Oh, it's Black History Month. Let me read a story. Because what we have done is that is not what culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy is. That is what I call a sprinkle. That is what I call an add-on. That is what I call an afterthought. And a lot of our students in our schools are getting from our educators a sprinkle, an afterthought, an add-on. And why do I say that? I say that because you have not considered who is in front of you. I'm going to share a quick story before I move on. You all know I use a lot of story. That's my pedagogy. I worked at a school for a couple of years in Toronto here. Amazing school. And I've taught grade 5, 6 with other teachers in the school. One of the grade 5, 6 topic is, one of the grade 6 topic, I should say, is Canada's response to the world. Under that topic comes the discussion on immigrant and refugees. It's in the curriculum, okay? And for years, we teach the class and, you know, privileged space, very, very nice school. And we teach about refugees. I want you to listen carefully. I left the school, wonderful school, and I moved on. And last year, a teacher at the school who teach grade 6, she called me. She said, I need to talk to you. She said to me, I want some ideas how to teach the topic. What would you do? And I said, what topic? She said, you know, about refugees. And I said, but you do that amazing. She's an amazing teacher. And she said, but Mr. Campbell, it's different this year. And I said, what makes it different? She said, I have refugee students in my class. So the years we have taught that topic, we talk about refugees. Now we have refugees in the classroom. What do I do? And I smile at her, and I'm going to be frank with you. I gave her no ideas. I said to her, you are going to be amazing. Why did I say that? I said that because if you as a teacher, and she's a white woman, and I hope you know that I'm very, 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 very deliberate in using Black and white and racialized and BIPOC and indigenous, those terminologies, because a lot of us come from a space where when you say Black or white or indigenous or white woman or Black man, we get funny. You don't need to feel funny. We need to talk about race. We need to talk about color. We need to talk about difference. And that is why on February the 8th, we're going to talk about that. That's going to be our topic, disrupted anti-Black racism, anti-Black racism from within. These are topics we must talk about, have courageous conversations about them. You know, when I see a teacher who refuses to have this conversation, I worry, because that is the same teacher who leaves the staff room and goes back to her classroom or his classroom, and there are 2 or 3 Black kids in front of her. There are 2 or 3 hijab wearing kids in front of her, but you refuse to engage in this conversation, but you are getting paid, you know, $90,000, $8,000 to engage all children. And you are telling me you are engaging those children well. You are not. Absolutely, you are not. We have to think about our own positionality and how we see our students. So let me get back to the story. And I said to her, I don't need to give you any advice or any information, because the fact that you thought it necessary to speak to me because your classroom has changed tells me you are at an amazing place as an educator. She is mindful of her students, and there is no way she would fail. I can guarantee you there is no way she's gonna fail, because she is mindful. So maybe I should ask you, are you mindful of the students you teach? Are you mindful of the families? Are you one of those teachers who is still teaching grade 2 families or grade 1, and you still have the one chart on the wall and on your poster, it's still one family, the nuclear family, a man, a woman, a boy, a girl, a daughter, a son, and a cat and a dog. Are you still doing that? Or you realize that you have students in your class who are same-sex couple. You have students in your class who have their extended family. Grandma is in charge. You have students in your class who are from single-parent family. Mom or dad alone is in charge. You have to make that clear. I'm going to tell you another quick story of this is important when we talk about deficit. Deficit. Do we see our students, our newcomers, our visual minorities, religion? I had someone who called me and he said to me, I had really a bad day, a sad day with my nephew. And he said to me, my nephew is in grade 3. I think it's grade 3, grade 2 or grade 3. And they were doing community. And the nephew came on very, very sad and he says, Uncle, why don't we live in a community? And he was like, what is this child talking about? And he realized, he called me, just so you know, I got the phone call from the uncle, very, very sad. He said, the child said, they talk about community today at school. And they live in housing. So this boy lives in a high-rise building in the city, you know, many urban areas, and some, you know, high-rise building, very urban area, apartment. Some of these houses are also what we call community housing, government housing. You all know some of these concepts. I hope you do. If not, something for you to think about, you know, something for you to really think about. Your students who come from community housing or government housing and how they are perceived and how you perceive them. And so this child said, they were looking at community and the teacher showed pictures of community. And he said to this uncle, where we live, she didn't show any pictures. So this child walked away thinking, I don't belong to a community. Because what she did, what some of us teachers have done in the past, is we show one idea of what a community looks like. So of course, you know, she showed the picture of the road with the houses, 2-car garage, you know, it's an avenue, it's lined with beautiful trees. You know those pictures you all grab from Google Pics, not realizing that representation of a community is not every child or all representations. And so as an educator, it is your job to bring in all representation so students feel a sense of belonging. So I want you to think about that as we think about deficit thinking. So what happens? Before I even get into that, I have a few questions. What is your classroom like today? What is your school like today? What do we do with the data as educational leaders, policymakers, and change agents? What do we do with all this data? What do we do with all this data? What does this, how does this data influence our actions in our schools? As educators, how do we impact change? We talk about urban education. We talk about issues in school. Right now, there's a group of you who are preparing your advocacy speech. What are you advocating? What are you advocating for? On whose behalf are you advocating? That is something for you to think about. I have had somebody ask me about advocacy and ideas. And I mean, I'm stuttering because for me, as an educator, there's something about being an educator that should raise a passion in you for advocacy that says, I have students I need to advocate on their behalf. So that is something that I want you to challenge yourself. Who are you advocating for? And if you are not advocating for anyone, why not? We like to call ourselves change agents. I teach leadership. I teach leadership. Right now, we're doing, I think two of the groups in here are doing leadership. Who are you leading? How are you leading? What is your leadership? Is it inclusive? Is it advocacy leadership? Some of us, we like to use the word transformational leaders, transformative leaders, authentic leaders. What does it really mean to be a transformational leader or a transformative leader? What does it really mean? I want you to think about that. As we own these terminologies, really put ourselves in the place and ask ourselves, are we doing that? So when we have our school system that is so impacted or affected by deficit thinking, what happens is that we can see the oppressive nature of our schools. We see deficit thinking evidence in the pedagogy and the practice. We see the lack of self-examination. You know what I find very troubling? I find very troubling. Every school you go to right now, there is an equity plan. There is a fight against racism and anti-Black racism. There is an EDI or DNI or JDEI, justice, social justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. There's so many acronyms going on, and there's so many work being done. But you know what is my issue? Who is doing the work? Who is doing the work? I have had the pleasure of being in spaces, and I have had to really shake my head at who is doing the work. Because you can sense the lack of self-examination, the lack of self-awareness, the lack of knowing who they are, the lack of understanding how their privilege impacts who they are and how they come to the work and how they approach the work. Think about that. Have you as an educator, as you as an educational leader, have you as a future educator, have you really examined your own power and your own privilege and how that looks in school and how the dynamics of that in school? Because what we find is a lack of accountability in many spaces, a lack of knowing our students. Educators who are located on the lower level of the cultural competence continuum. I really want to repeat that. Educators who are located on the lower level of the cultural competence continuum. You know, we have seen this kind of practice from our teachers who are said to be well-intentioned. Well-intentioned. It is like the idea of a thing of hunger, starvation, bare feet, long walking distance, etc. We hear that when we hear that, we immediately hear the word Africa, not realizing that we have students in our school who are being disenfranchised every day because of those deficit concepts and ideas. We foster microaggression. Wow, she reads well. Oh, for a recent immigrant. We have it in our school. I'm going to tell you a sad story. I was in a workshop. And someone from the TDSB was in charge of leading the workshop in the school I was at. And it was a math workshop. And we're talking about maths vocabulary and the importance of understanding maths vocabulary to maths content, to maths concept. And it was a really beautiful workshop. And the presenter said to us, she said, I went to a school out by Islington and Finch area. That's what she said. She said, I went to a school out by Islington and Finch area. And she said, I was shocked at the vocabulary that those students had. If you don't understand deficit thinking, I want you to get it now. This is a maths coach or a maths lead from the TDSB saying to a group of teachers in another space how surprised she was when she heard the maths vocabulary of students who came from a school out by Islington and Finch. I want you to understand what deficit looks like. She did not expect that from them. So I want you to think to yourself, you may say, well, Dr. Campbell, that could be honest. She's honest. She didn't expect it. Okay, fine. Let's say that. What made her not expect that? What kind of thinking? What kind of thinking? What kind of knowledge? What kind of misinformation? What kind of assumptions and stereotype you think allowed that? So that's my question. What kind of unconscious bias and stereotype? And I'm going to actually stop saying conscious bias. What kind of conscious bias you think she had which allowed her to say that. And I want you to own it. I want you to own it as educators, because we said it from the very beginning that deficit thinking in our school has interrupted, has affected, has disrupted how many of our students are treated, has impacted the pedagogy and the practice of our teachers. So imagine if that was your school and you think these students have, they're not at a certain level. How will you teach them? How do you approach them? How do you approach them? So we talk about this, saying the lower level of the continuum. And I will always be showing you this. It's important that you understand the importance of the cultural competence continuum. Every one of us, if we walk away from this class, this lecture tonight, you should ask yourself, where am I on the cultural competence continuum? Where are you? Because I'm going to tell you this, all of us, we are somewhere. All of us, we are somewhere there. All of us, we are somewhere on the continuum. And you have to ask yourself, where are you on the continuum? You have to ask yourself, where are you on the continuum? And how does your position on the continuum impact? How does that impact your teaching, your ability to engage the students? How does that impact your leadership, your pedagogy, your practice, your planning? Where are you on the continuum? You know how many teachers are culturally blind? I'm going to ask you a question. If you're a culturally blind teacher, how do you see the students? Because I could tell you right now, it's happening a lot. When you speak to the student, they're telling you, I don't think my teachers see me. I don't feel seen. This is facts I'm giving you. This is content I'm giving you from different research where students are saying, racialized students, Black students, other students are saying, I do not feel seen. I did an entire thing on the invisible student, LGBTQ student in school who said, I don't feel seen. So I want you now to take on that level of reflection as a teacher in an urban space, in a rural space, whatever space you are teaching in. Think to yourself, where am I on the continuum? Because I can tell you right now, every single school board is putting together an equity framework. Every school is updating their equity framework, their racism or their anti-Black racism framework. I mean, there are documents going left, right, and center. I bet you one or two of you in this room are listening to me. You're also on the committee that is working on some of these documents. Fine. But other than the document, where are you? The person. Where are you, the person on the continuum? Do you have the cultural humility it requires? Do you have the moral courage it requires to disrupt deficit thinking? Because deficit thinking has to be disrupted by us. So why do we disrupt and dismantle? 4 things I'm going to leave with you. I'm going to leave 4 things with you. Why dismantle? Deficit thinking oversimplifies students' vast, heterogeneous experiences. Deficit thinking focuses on students' perceived shortcomings rather than their strengths. Strength-based pedagogy we should be looking at. Deficit thinking focuses on language that further oppresses. You ever heard the language? You see how we use them in school. We have to learn how to kind of think about the language you use in school. At risk, marginalized. Why is a student at risk? What makes a student at risk? Who defines at risk? So we think about the language, and deficit thinking undermines. So the first one, deficit thinking oversimplifies students' vast and heterogeneous experiences. And that is why I use this part. You have seen this, maybe see this picture in full. I use the equality photograph here to show you that when we think in our schools, we give everybody the same opportunity. And I've heard teachers say that. I'm sure you have heard teachers say that. Well, all my students get the same opportunity. I am this teacher who is fair. I give everybody the same thing. Well, everybody can't get the same thing because everybody don't need the same thing. And that is why we move from the idea of equality to equity. Because if we give each of these students the same box to stand on, we will still have students who are disadvantaged. And so that is why the word accommodations and extensions and modifications, those words have to become a part of how we teach, realizing that not because I give you an accommodation mean you are any less valuable in the class. It means I am reaching you because you need to be reached in another space, in another way. I remember as a young teacher, the first time someone was given an oral exam in my presence versus a written exam, I remember that experience. I learned so much because a child who cannot read and focus on the paper could answer the questions being given. And I must tell you the experience I had. The oral exam was given to the student by his peer. So a student sat with the student and asked the exam questions, and the answers were on point. But this student could not sit down with the paper in front of them. Luckily, we found that out quite early. The parent assisted us in finding that out. And this child was able to take the exam in different format. So the word accommodation is not a bad word. See, we use the word accommodation always in such a negative. When a student gives me a letter of accommodation, I don't necessarily think, oh, you're a bad student or you can't learn, that's why you need something. No, there are many reasons why someone needs an accommodation. One of my best students, when I just came to Oise here, a student walked in, that student had a guide dog. Not a guide dog, she's not blind. She had a one of those dogs that you have with you. It's what a guide dog. I'm forgetting the terminology, but it was one of those dogs that helped her with her anxiety. And let me tell you something, amazing student, amazing. One of my amazing, thank you so much. Service animal, thank you, come on. Emotional support dog, thank you for that. This is what we're talking about. Thank you for that sharing. Service dog, service animal, emotional support dog. See, chat box is alive. Thank you so much for that. And I will never forget walking in the classroom. I've never had that before. My first time as a teacher, seeing a student with a service dog, an emotional support animal in the classroom. And the minute I know what the dog was for, we moved on. And today, one of my best student experience with our work, with our research, amazing, amazing. So we have to be careful how we see othered as less than. I hope you understand what I just said. We have to be careful how we view othered as less than and deficit. Because some of us would see the service dog and immediately you go, oh, well, I have to do this, I have to do that, and oh my God, and she can't. One of my best research students, as a matter of fact, one of the students who got our research published and used, and amazing. Because what I saw, I did not oversimplify our experience. We have to think about what deficit allows us to do. Deficit focus on students' perceived shortcomings rather than their strengths. You have seen this before. You have seen this before. Educators operating through a deficit lens do not acknowledge the varied life experiences of marginalized students, rather than encouraging students to inform the nature of the learning environment. Educators attempt to fix them, to fit into the mold defined by the society, rife with inequities such as sexism, racism, ableism, and classism. And that comes to us. You know, that's another quote that comes to us. We have to understand, how do we create a space where all these persons who are going to take this in this classroom are seen as having the ability to do well? But you see what happened in this picture, right? There's one exam and it's to climb the tree. So you realize there are students here who will have absolutely no chance of doing well. Think about the exams as a metaphor. What are the things you have in your school, in your urban school, in your rural school, in your school plan, in your school development plan, in your equity plan, in your framework? What are the things that you have that will undermine students' strength from the very start? I'm going to tell you another story. I think I've told this before. Some of you may have heard it. Some of you have not heard it. I'm sure that I went to a workshop once, and it was 120 immigrants. And I asked them, what are the things you brought with you when you were coming to Canada in your suitcase? I remember I had the picture of a suitcase on my slide, and I said, list the things that you brought in your suitcase. Room filled with 120 immigrants. And they started listing my qualification, my PhD, my master's, my certificate. Then they started getting to it. My husband, my wife, my kids, my love, my religion, my hijab, my burqa, my turban, my accent, my food, my music, my dance, my cultural costume. And they were just going at it. Amazing. And then I said to them, of all the things you brought in your suitcase, list the top 3 things that you believe you have been rejected for since coming to Canada. Of those top 3, accent was one of the top 3, accent. Now you want me to give you why this story is so relevant to our conversation? This was an organization that their job was to get these immigrants and assist them in in finding job hunting. But what they do a lot is to host networking events. So they host networking events and they encourage the immigrants to attend networking events. Now, I want you to understand, if you know that your accent you're going to be chastised and devalued and put in deficit because of your accent, how often would you attend a networking event where you have to speak up? I want you to think about that for a minute. You see where the tension is? You see where the failure is happening? I want you to think about that for a minute. So here are persons who are saying, I will not participate because once I open my mouth, I lose my value. And I could tell you that. When I introduce myself, I talk about my Jamaican accent, and I have already dispelled the deficit energy that is going to be brought towards me. So deficit thinking focuses on language that further oppresses. And you know them, disadvantage. I want you to listen, just hear the words that we use a lot. Disadvantaged students, marginalized students, vulnerable students, minority students, those students from those areas, difficult students, inner city students, at-risk students. There's work to be done in how we talk about our students. There's work to be done in how we talk about our students. Thank you. At risk. Any other word? I saw that. Thank you, Jamie. I see it in the chat box. Any other terminologies? Go ahead and share them. We have to be careful how we talk about our students. If you have another terminology, throw it in the chat box, please, so we can learn. We as a troubled, oh, that's a big one, Tanya, troubled students. As a profession, we have been keen to adopt language such as at risk, gaps, aging, to describe entire group of students. These terms are a manifestation of deficit thinking. And that's from N. Heinbach et al. 2019. Problematic, vulnerable youth. We have to be careful the language we use. And the last one is deficit thinking undermines. We need to ensure that inclusivity is not enacted within a system framework organized according to deficit mentality on the part of educators, policymakers, or theorists. We believe that enacting or embracing a deficit mentality whilst dealing with difference undermines the most fundamental objective of inclusion to fulfill the basic rights of all in an equitable manner. If you're going to undermine, are we going to learn? And I love this quote. I love this quote from, and I'm going to leave you with this. I love this quote from the message from the chair and director, 2018 from the Toronto Catholic District Board Equity Action Plan, 2018 to 2021. I love this. I use this as the closing to show you what is it that we should be striving towards. What is it is our goal? And I leave it there, but I'm going to highlight some words in red. The same quote, just highlight some in red. And you have seen students' lived experiences. Are we there? Do we acknowledge our students' lived experiences? Valued and celebrated. Right now, many schools are into a discussion. Who is valued and who is celebrated in our schools? Do they see themselves in the curriculum? Everybody's planning their Black History Month celebration. Many persons keep making mistakes every single year, and I guarantee you this year will be no different. You will be hearing the news of some of the errors that principals and vice principals and teachers are creating or doing in our schools. Say they are celebrating Black History Month. Because when you're truly not engaged and it's pretentious and it's performative, you will not do a good job. How do they see themselves in the curriculum? Are they authentically engaged? Are the barriers identified and removed? We have barriers in our schools. We have a lot of barriers in our schools. I remember the newspaper article that came out in 2019 with a school in Alberta that decided to say no do-rag. So a do-rag was put in as something not to wear to school. Of all the head coverings, you put in a do-rag. So what you're doing is saying students from a particular background, a particular identity, you should not wear this to school. Who decided to make a do-rag something not appropriate for school? Who made that decision? Look around your school and see who is making the decisions. Where are they making decisions from? What space, what place are they making the decisions from? What perceptions do they hold when making these decisions? And we love to use the word welcoming, safe, and inclusive school environment. Who decides it's welcoming? Who decides if it's safe? Who decides what makes it inclusive? I've seen a lot of people do something and they have an organization or they have a room or they have a school and they said, this is our safe space. I remember, I will never forget coming to Canada 2008. And I just got my first job at a career college. And a teacher there would call her classroom a safe space where she would have certain discussions. And I remember I said to her, what makes this space safe? Because why did I do that? Because I was a director. But why did I do that? Is because I would consistently hear students complaining about what was said and how it was said and who it was said to and how their business was discussed in the car park. And I said to the teacher, you can't just call this class a safe space if the students do not feel safe. And we have it a lot. Cute, a safe space. So, breaking down the deficit thinking, I've said this to you before, it's not new. Breaking down the deficit thinking, we begin the work. We must begin the work through the use of strength-based approach. Write that down, make a note of that. That may be something somebody wants to discuss in their follow-up activity. Strength-based approach. I would love to maybe read one or two of your follow-up later on when you talk about strength-based approach. And one of my strength-based approach is the principles of CRRP, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. Focus on students' strength, focus on students' previous experiences, their cultural capital. It's adopt alternative pedagogies. There are many ways to teach. There are many ways of knowing. There are many ways of doing. UDL, Universal Design for Learning, explains that to us. Something some of us need to look at, UDL. Please to take a minute to look at that. Alternative ways of knowing. What is considered knowledge? We have to break away from that. We have to learn to decolonize what we do. Many of us, we are so wired. If it's not in a journal, if it's not in a scholarly article, then it has no value. That's not true. That's not true. There are many valuable voices that are not in your textbooks because they have been excluded by power and privilege and institutionalized oppressive practices that says only if you have a PhD, we're going to allow you to write in this journal. You think everybody with a PhD are the persons who have knowledge? You really think all the knowledge rests in somebody with a PhD? Our authentic indigenous knowledge, the knowledge we get from our ancestors. People ask me about my storytelling. I say to them, I sit at my grandmother's feet, sometimes for weeks. I'm with my grandmother alone in the country and listen to the stories and the knowledge. I learned so much about England from my grandmother. I learned about snow and winter from my grandmother before I even been on a plane. She would tell me stories. Her stories are better stories than stories I've read in books. Little did I know that we were supposed to capture these stories. I do have them in my heart, and I'm working on one day putting them in paper. But how do we get that? Focus on language. We have to learn to focus on language of hope and becoming. Acknowledge the need for unique populations without diminishing the complexities of their lives. School is a safe space where students can connect to their own identities and build foundation of confidence, self-esteem, and self-awareness. I'm going to use it as my final comment. School should be seen through culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, through other ways of knowing, through the disruption and dismantling of deficit thinking as a safe space. That's the time we use it, where students can connect to their own identities and build a foundation of confidence, self-esteem, and self-awareness. So that is it. We're going to stop there for our recording.